Well, welcome everyone to Egg Harbor Library's program on birdscaping. And that's a real term, getting birds in your yard. And today we have Karen Newbern here, who will be teaching us all about birdscaping. Karen is a master gardener, and she was in my master gardening class. She's has a wealth of knowledge. She'll tell you a little bit about herself, but she has done a lot with nature. And right now she is working at Door Landscaping, which has all native species there. You know, what I've learned from our invasive species program last week, that sometimes when you go to a garden center, they might sell you an invasive species because it's pretty and it works well in the soil, but sometimes that's not good. But Karen knows all that because she's a master gardener and she works at Door Landscaping, and she knows all about birdscaping too. So I'm going to let Karen do all the talking now, and I'm going to mute myself and welcome Karen.
Well, thank you. I'm really glad to be here this afternoon. I can't say that I know everything that there is to know about native plants, but I have been a naturalist for about 35 years, and I've always been more interested in native plantings. And I'll put in, I don't want to be accused of shameless self-promotion, but I'll do it anyway. Door Landscape and Nursery does specialize in native plants. So a lot of the trees and shrubs and things that we're going to be talking about today are available at Door Landscape. And if you're interested, you can contact me there, and I'd be happy to share more with you about that. I think it's really appropriate that we do this program here in early April, because as most of you probably already realize, a lot of our, the winter migrants are coming back. We're seeing robins all over the place, red-winged blackbirds. I haven't heard any reports, but I'm guessing that bluebirds are back in the county. So it's always fun this time of the year to see those birds coming back, welcome them back from their their winter residences. But in today's program, what I want to do is I want to kind of give you some ideas for how you can attract those birds to your yard and maybe keep them there. Maybe make them a little bit more kind of full-time residents, at least in the summer when they're spending their time here. So what I will do is I'll share my screen here. And there it is. I'm kind of new to this, so you'll have to bear with me. And we will do that. Push that button, I think. There we go. Alrighty, there we are. Okay, so birdscaping, I think actually is kind of a made-up word, but it's pretty descriptive. It's just how do you landscape your yard in order to benefit and attract birds. And today I am going to be focusing on native plants, although that's not to say that non-native things are always, that are not necessarily good for plants. There are some non-native things that can be very beneficial, but I'm going to focus a little bit more on the native stuff as we talk here. Now, one of the first things that people will often do when they think about attracting birds to their yard is they'll put up bird feeders. And that's a great first step. Certainly you're going to, sometimes it seems like you put the feeders up and the birds are there almost instantly. Sometimes it takes them a little bit longer to find it. But once the birds do know that, you're providing food for them, they will continue coming for that. But the food is only one part of the picture. If we want to attract birds and keep them in their yards and really benefit them, we have to think about habitat. And habitat loss is the biggest cause of population decline in many species of birds, particularly if you think of grassland birds like bobolinks or sparrows. Those birds, most of our grasslands, our native grasslands, have been converted either to agricultural use or to, housing developments, whatever. So grassland species in particular are suffering because the habitat is just disappearing. With woodland birds, it's the same, probably not quite as severe, but it's the same kind of thing. Disappearing habitat is going to really be detrimental to bird populations. So if we can provide a little bit better habitat in our yards, then we can kind of counter effect the loss of habitat in other areas. So the first thing we want to do is talk about really what habitat involves. And there's a couple of different components to it. Usually we think of food as the first thing. What can I plant in my yard that's going to help feed the birds? And certainly that is a really important part of the habitat, but it's not the whole picture. We also have to consider water. Now, if you're lucky enough to live near a stream or a pond, you have a built-in source of water, that's certainly going to be much more attractive to the birds because they don't want to fly a long distance. They want all of these things to be kind of close together so they're not expending a lot of energy to get from the food to the water and so on. Shelter or cover is also very important. Most birds are prey species, which means they're always on the lookout for something that's going to try to eat them. So they need to have a safe place where they can hide. They need to have cover where they can build their nests and safely raise their young. So that's a really important component. We're going to talk about some plants later on that provide really good shelter or cover for birds. And then all of these things have to be kind of arranged appropriately. As I mentioned, if the food is a mile away from the water, the birds are not going to be able to use that efficiently. So we want to have all of these things in fairly close proximity so that it's easier for the birds to get to them. Now, when we talk about improving habitat, native plants usually provide much better habitat conditions than non-native species do. And the reason for that is pretty simple. The plants, the native plants and our native birds have evolved and developed together. And there's a great deal of interdependency, So the birds are going to rely more on native species. If a plant is introduced that the birds are not familiar with, maybe it doesn't provide the right kind of food, or maybe it's not as good shelter. One example I found was that scientists looked at robins that nested in native hawthorn trees or native viburnums and compared those to robins nesting in non-native shrubs. And they actually found that the birds nesting in the native plants had a higher rate of success raising their young. So, it has to do with the structure of the native plants, the way that they grow. Hawthorns have thorns, which of course are protective. So native plants are almost always going to be the best bet when you talk about improving bird habitat. Now I want to talk a little bit about food. Because like I said, that's the first thing we come to, and that's probably the easiest thing to provide for birds in your backyard. And usually, again, we think about birds that eat seeds and berries, so we want to plant shrubs or trees that have fruit on them or produce a lot of seeds. But that's only part of the equation. We have to look at the bird's whole life cycle and think about, what do they eat when they're babies? Baby chickadees don't eat black oil sunflower seeds. Most bird species, even if they're seed eaters as adults, the young birds are eating insects, and primarily caterpillars or the larvae of different types of insects. The reason for that is pretty simple. A caterpillar or a bug is going to be packed full of proteins and fats and all of the things that a very, very fast growing baby bird is going to need. So it's like a little high energy package of food that provides a lot more nutrients than seeds will. Not to say that seeds are bad, but when the babies are growing up, they need that extra protein and that extra fat. And they need a lot of it. I don't know if any of you have ever been lucky enough to watch chickadees, for example, when they're nesting and feeding their young. But a single pair of chickadees needs to feed their young 7,500 caterpillars for just the one brood, just to get them through the couple of weeks until they're adults. And then if you think about birds like bluebirds, oftentimes will have 2 or sometimes even 3 broods of young in a year. So take that 7,500 and multiply it by 2 or 3. You can see that in order to provide really good food for the young, we have to have insects. And this is where some people go, wait a minute. Now, insects are supposed to be bad. I don't want insects. I want a bug-free backyard. Well, you can have a bug-free backyard, but if you do, chances are you're not going to have very many birds there. You'll have birds passing through. You'll have adult birds maybe coming to the feeders, but they're certainly not going to nest or stay for a very long time if you've got a completely bug-free backyard. So bugs are okay. Bugs are good. We're going to talk a lot more about bugs as we go through the program. All right, so, and I've been talking about the use of native plants. I think we need to take just a kind of step back for just a second and talk about what native plants really are, and also talk about some of the other terms that come up when we're talking about planting and landscaping in our yards. There's a lot of different definitions of native plants floating around out there. The one that I find the most useful is one that was developed by the Wild Ones organization. Wild Ones is a national nonprofit group. They encourage people to do native plantings in their home landscapes. Their tagline, their motto is restoring the earth 1 yard at a time. And their definition of a native plant is a species that occurs naturally in a particular region, ecosystem, or habitat, and that was present prior to European settlement. So there's a couple of different facets to the native definition. First of all, it's something that grows naturally without any help from people, wasn't planted there. It occurs in a particular region. Native plants, if we talk about a plant that's native to Wisconsin, it may be very, very different from a native plant from California. Or it may be a plant that's native to wetlands, but not to prairies. So the native definition includes that kind of region or where of that plant. And then the other factor is that they were present prior to European settlement. How do we know what was here before the settlers got here? We actually have a lot of records from the early explorers. Lewis and Clark, for example, as they traveled through the western US, were documenting the plants and the wildlife that they found. So we have pretty good records going back quite a ways, and we can usually determine, where if these plants were here before people stepped in and started planting them. So just a couple of little examples here of native plants that we're going to see flowering very soon, especially if this warm weather keeps up. The trillium, the white trillium, and the yellow trout lily. A couple examples of truly native plants, native to Door County, actually. Introduced is another term. You'll hear this quite a lot, and basically it means anything that's not native. It's a species that doesn't naturally occur in a given region, but it's intentionally or otherwise moved from somewhere else. Now, I want to throw in a little bit of a caution here. If you go to a store and they have a wildflower seed mix, what I sometimes call meadow in a can, be very careful and check to see what species are actually in that, because found that a lot of those wildflower seed mixes contain plants that are native, but not to Wisconsin or the Midwest. Just as an example, California poppy shows up a lot in those wildflower seed mixes, and it'll grow here, but it isn't a truly native plant. So you want to kind of watch out for that. But most of the plants that we use in our home landscapes are introduced. They might also have other names. They might be called non-native. I usually use that term just to differentiate the two. Sometimes they're called exotic or alien. So those are terms that you'll hear for them as well. Something that isn't strictly native. Naturalized is another term that you'll hear sometimes, and it's a non-native plant, but it's become so well established and it's so widespread that people usually consider that it's native. So we think about the Queen Anne's lace that we see every summer. It's everywhere, it's widespread. The orange ditch lilies, daylilies, daisies, those are all plants that we usually think of as native because they have been here a long time. Certainly before any of us were here, but they were originally brought in from somewhere else. They're so widespread, we just kind of think of them as being native. Not necessarily good or bad. Some of them are pretty good for birds and other wildlife, some not so much. Now, aggressive is a term that describes more what the plant does rather than where it came from. An aggressive plant is simply that. It's something that will outcompete other plants. It'll crowd them out. It'll take over an area. Usually they don't become a real widespread problem, excuse me. They may be localized. Some of the examples that we see here in Door County, the forget-me-nots, which everybody loves to see as they drive through Peninsula State Park. They are an aggressive non-native. They seed like crazy. They reproduce well. They can crowd out a lot of our native wildflowers and plants. Or lily of the valley. I love lily of the valley. It's one of those old-fashioned plants that I grew up with. In my home garden, they're fine, but I wouldn't want to plant them if I lived near a nice pristine woodland, because if you've ever grown lily of the valley, you know they spread like crazy and they're hard to eradicate if they get into places you don't want them. Now, it's important here to note that some native plants can also become very aggressive. Especially if you put them in a garden situation where they have rich soil and lots of watering and maybe a little miracle grow, they can go crazy too. This is a native plant called cup plant. It's a prairie native. And in a native prairie, it's controlled because of competition with other plants and so on. If you put it in a garden situation, it will get to be about 8 feet tall, and the clumps will spread very, very quickly, and the stems are almost like wood. They're really, really hard to get rid of. It's a great plant, don't get me wrong, but I do not recommend that people plant this one in their home landscapes unless you've got a lot of room, or if you plant it in fairly poor soil and don't baby it, then it'll behave itself. But some things, some plants, native and non-native, can kind of become garden thugs if you let them. And then invasives, like Janine mentioned, there was a program about invasive species last month. Invasives are non-native plants which have the potential to spread long distances and definitely do outcompete native plants. And there's a lot of them here in Door County. Just a couple of them here in the photos. The lower left is garlic mustard, which is a huge problem in our woodlands. Garlic mustard is particularly difficult because not only does it crowd out other plants, but it actually changes the chemistry of the soil in a way that tree seedlings don't germinate very well. So you can eradicate all the garlic mustard in an area, but there's this chemical residue, if you will, that remains in the soil that makes it difficult to get other plants established. In the middle is buckthorn. Birds do eat the berries of buckthorn, but they are not very nutritious, and they spread the berries around so that the buckthorn spreads very rapidly and can very quickly take over a woodland. In the upper right there is purple loosestrife, beautiful plant, but very, very invasive in wetlands. And the lower right picture, a plant that a lot of you are probably familiar with, Phragmites, sometimes called giant reed grass. And it is a giant. It'll get 8, 10, 12 feet tall and spreads very quickly and is very, very challenging to eradicate. And then I'm going to throw in the term wildflower just because, that's one that it gets put around a lot. And a wildflower is simply any plant that's growing without assistance, something that people don't have to take care of for it to thrive. A wildflower could be a native plant, could be something that's naturalized, it could be something invasive. Of the plants that I have pictured here, the only one that is actually native is the one on the right, the dwarf lake iris, which, by the way, is only native to a very, very small region around Lake Michigan. The other two plants, the chicory and the oxeye daisy, are both naturalized, non-native plants. But we call them all wildflowers because they grow wild and we don't have to tend to them. We don't have to take care of them as we would with some of our more touchy or more picky cultivated plants. And then one other term, and you'll hear this occasionally in the nursery trade, is nativar. And a nativar, it's a combination of the words native and cultivar. A cultivar is simply a plant that has been manipulated by people to improve it in some way, maybe more flowers or smaller size or bigger size or fall color, whatever. So a nativar is a selection of a native species that was chosen for whatever characteristic. Maybe it has more flowers. Maybe it has different colored foliage. Maybe it grows smaller or larger. Maybe it's more disease resistant. So it's just taking a native species and tweaking it a little bit to make it better in some way or make it more attractive in some way. And a good example of that is the common ninebark, which is the shrub you see here. Ninebark is widespread in Door County. It's really a nice shrub. It has kind of arching branches, white clusters of flowers, beautiful fall color, kind of an orangey yellow fall color. But the plant hybridizers decided that ninebark needed to be made better. So they made lots of different varieties of ninebark. So there's some that have burgundy foliage, like summer wine. And we have autumn jazz, which has kind of orangey foliage all summer long, really kind of a bronzy color. Or amber jubilee, which has that golden kind of chartreusey foliage. They all have pretty much the same flowers. Some are bigger, some are smaller. But they've taken a native plant and done a little bit of selective breeding and created something that's a little different. Now, are nativars better or worse for birds or wildlife habitat? The answer is it depends. Some of them provide a lot of the same benefits that the native ninebark does. Some of them do not. One example that I will put out there is coneflowers or echinacea. The purple coneflower, which is the native, provides a lot of nectar and pollen and seeds for birds. But some of the cultivars, for example, if they hybridize the coneflower so that it has a lot of extra petals, that means it's not going to produce as much pollen and nectar, or maybe not any pollen or nectar at all, just lots and lots of petals. So it's a really beautiful plant, but it's not going to be of much benefit to birds or insects. So with nativars, again, like I said, it depends. Some of them have been found to be quite attractive and just as beneficial as the native varieties, some of them not so much. So again, be cautious when you're buying things and don't be afraid to ask questions about the plants that you're looking at. All right, so we know what native plants are and how we can, if it's a nativar or whatever. Now we need to talk a little bit about why do we want to use natives in our landscapes instead of some of these really beautiful ornamental plants that we have? Well, there's actually quite a few reasons. The biggest reason, and I kind of mentioned this before, birds and animals and other wildlife have developed along with the plants. And so they depend on one another and they provide benefits for one another. So native plants are going to be more attractive to our native wildlife. Birds, beneficial insects like pollinators, butterflies, hummingbirds, even things like frogs and snakes and other bugs. The native plants are going to provide the habitat kinds of conditions that those creatures need. So one of the research studies I was reading said that there's some evidence that if you plant native plants in your yard that provide pollen and nectar, the pollinators will in turn be more effective at pollinating your fruit trees or crops like raspberries. So by planting some natives like goldenrod or whatever, you can actually improve the yields in your garden or in your orchard, which I think is kind of a fascinating connection. Even though the raspberries aren't really a native plant, the insects are going to pollinate those too, and they're going to get the nectar and the pollen that they need from the native plants as well. We know that native plants are the caterpillar food or larval food for many different species of butterflies. So again, this is not directly related to birds, but it's a definite benefit of native plants. We're all familiar with monarch butterflies and how they depend on milkweed for their caterpillar food, or host plant is called. By the way, milkweed flowers are also very attractive to a lot of different insects, many different kinds of butterflies, bees, flies, wasps, all kinds of different insects will feed on the nectar from milkweed. So it's a really beneficial plant, not just for the monarchs though. Here's a couple examples of some other native plants that are larval food or caterpillar food for different butterflies. This is a flower called white turtlehead. It's native to our wetlands here in Door County. The flower kind of looks like the head of a turtle. It is the host plant, or provides caterpillar food, for the Baltimore checker spot butterfly. And the Baltimore checker spot is only found in areas where the white turtlehead is growing. It's very dependent on that plant. Plants that are in the dill family, dill, parsley, cilantro, Queen Anne's lace. In this case, it's a native called Golden Alexanders. Those provide caterpillar food. They're a host plant for swallowtail butterflies. And wild indigo is a host plant for the silver hairstreak and other hairstreak butterflies. So along with providing benefits to your bird life, you may be benefiting butterflies and other kinds of insects and wildlife as well. Native plants can also provide year-round benefits to birds and other wildlife. In the spring, summer, fall, we have flowers that provide nectar and pollen. Later in the season, we have seeds that birds can feed on. And in the winter, those plants are left standing. They'll actually help to hold up the snow. There will be air pockets underneath the snow where birds and other small animals can be insulated and protected from the extremes of the weather. A lot of insects spend the winter in the stems, in the hollow stems of native plants. So there's a trend right now toward what we might call messy gardening or lazy gardening, leaving those, instead of cleaning everything up and cutting everything back to the ground in the fall, leaving the plants, particularly the native plants, provide benefits to the birds. The seeds are a source of food during the winter for birds as well. In general, native plantings are much easier to maintain than our very landscaped, very well-maintained landscapes. They require less frequent watering. Our native plants have evolved with our climate, with our rainfall conditions, with our soils. So once they're established, they generally do not need much watering, if any at all. They don't require a lot of fertilizer to be beautiful. I kind of mentioned the cup plant earlier and, give it a little miracle grow. Native plants don't need that. They certainly will benefit from it, but it's not a necessity. They'll grow just fine without a lot of outside applications of fertilizer or whatever. There's usually less need for pesticides. Not that insects won't eat the natives, but they're more resistant to it. And they could tolerate the insect damage maybe a little bit better than some of our ornamentals will. Less pruning and grooming. Natives do just fine by themselves. We don't have to tend to them a lot. And so if you're not watering and fertilizing and pesticiding and grooming and taking care of plants, that means you have a lot more time to enjoy your landscape and enjoy the residents, the wild residents that are going to come in and live there too. Using natives is also good for the environment, particularly when we're talking about lawns. Lawns are great, and there are certainly places where lawns are kind of a necessity. You wouldn't want to try to play golf in a native prairie. It just doesn't work well. But if we use more native plants, we can reduce our water use. Again, the natives don't need frequent watering, and that can result in better water quality as well. Native plants, especially prairie plants, have very, very deep roots. And so what they help to do is they help to hold water in the soil rather than letting it wash off when we have heavy rains. And since you won't be using as many pesticides or fertilizers, those chemicals won't be running off into the storm sewers, into the bay or the lake. So there's a direct benefit to water quality. If in the case of lawns, if you're doing less mowing, you use your power equipment less frequently and less air pollution. I was really surprised to read that using a lawnmower for 1 hour, because they don't have all the pollution controls that our cars do, using a mower for 1 hour produces the same amount of pollution as driving your car 100 miles. That's a kind of a scary statistic. But if you think about, okay, well, if I don't have lawn or I eliminate some of my lawn, I'm not going to be creating all of that pollution. Using natives can also increase the biodiversity of your property. And biodiversity is important because it gives you a stable ecosystem, a stable system. The more different varieties that you have, the better that habitat is going to be able to withstand a drought or an insect infestation or a particularly severe winter. It might affect some of the plants in your landscape, but most of them are going to survive and do just fine. And so just as a comparison, if you looked at a native prairie, there might be over 100 different species of plants growing in that particular ecosystem. Typical home landscape, it varies quite a lot. Some people are like me and they want to plant one of everything that's out there. Some people like to plant a lot of one thing, a big rose garden or, whatever. So, in a traditional landscape, maybe 20 or 25 species, maybe more, but certainly not 100. And those plants, of course, are going to be supporting a lot of other wildlife. Biodiversity is not just the plants, it's everything that's out there, all of the living stuff that's out there. So the insects and the worms and the fungi, the soil microorganisms that break down the leaves and dead plant material, all of those things can be enhanced and help to create a more stable ecosystem, again, by using the native plants. And when we talk about biodiversity, let's go back to the bird feeding their babies, the chickadee feeding her babies, caterpillars. Dr. Doug Tallamy, who is a well-known expert on using natives in the landscape and the benefits of native plantings, did a little experiment at one time. He picked out 2 trees in his neighborhood that were similar in size and similar in age. One of them was a Bradford pear. That's the tree on the left. Beautiful white flowers in the spring. They used to be planted extensively as a street tree because they're relatively tolerant of pollution. They do well in an urban kind of a setting. So he walked around, he found this tree and he walked around it, and just at eye level, he counted how many caterpillars he could find that were feeding on the tree. He found one caterpillar. So then he found a white oak tree, which was about the same size, about the same age. He did the same test, and granted, this is not highly scientific, but as he walked around the tree, looking again at eye level and counting caterpillars, he counted over 200 caterpillars, and there were between 15 and 19 different species of insects represented there. So if you're a chickadee and you're looking for larvae to feed your babies, it's pretty obvious which tree you would prefer. Now, you might also think that, well, gee whiz, with all those caterpillars on that tree, it would be completely stripped. And actually, from a short distance away, there was almost no damage visible. Even though it had that many caterpillars feeding on it, and certainly more in the rest of the tree, the insects were being controlled, I'm sure, by the birds in the area. So yes, there was a kind of a high insect population there, but the birds were also probably having a feast on that tree. So that's an example of how just choosing one tree to plant, how much of a difference that can make in the diversity in your yard and how much of a benefit that can be to birds. One of the things I think too about improving bird habitat is that it gives us that close connection to nature that I think all of us need. Leo Tolstoy wrote that one of the first conditions of happiness is that the link between man and nature shall not be broken. And I think that in the last year, we've all realized that we need nature. We need to make a connection with what's outdoors. And whether it be watching the birds at our feeder or hand feeding them at Peninsula Park, we want that connection and we need that. And we can do that. It's also a great educational opportunity, not just for kids, but for adults as well. A great chance to learn about the things that are visiting our yards and bring more things in there. So if you think about the popularity of hobbies like bird watching, like butterfly gardening, people are really looking for that connection, and native plants can help to make that connection happen. Okay, so we've talked about what natives are and what the benefits are. Let's talk a little bit about how you can best work on improving the bird habitat in your yard. One of the things that I always recommend to people is that they plant woody plants, trees and shrubs. Now, we usually plant trees for shade, and we plant shrubs that might have pretty flowers on them. Woody plants are really important, especially in providing cover and protection for birds and for nesting locations. So by adding woody plants to your landscape, it can have a huge benefit to the bird life in your yard. One study showed that if you increased the tree and shrub density in your yard by 50%, you could see a 50% increase in the birds using your yard. So think about woody plants. when you're considering what to add to your yard. You may want to consider reducing or possibly even eliminating your lawn. Mentioned before the environmental impacts of having a lawn, and a lawn grass is not very beneficial to very much wildlife. The cottontail rabbits will probably love that you have a nice lush green lawn, but there's not going to be much else that really uses that. So you can either, stop mowing corners of the yard and let them grow up a little bit and get a little weedy or a little messy looking. You might consider replacing, if you like the look of grass, you might consider replacing the lawn grass with something like this. This is called no-mow fescue. It's a fescue grass, a blend of fescue grasses actually, that don't require mowing. They grow about 8 to 10 inches tall, very flowing. Some people do mow them a couple times a year just to kind of tidy them up a little bit. But it's a great alternative if you want that green lawn kind of appearance. You can also use varieties of sedges. If you have a woodland in particular, many sedges have a grassy appearance. They grow well in shade, where most of our lawn grasses will not. Leave the leaves. Again, going back to that idea of messy gardening or lazy gardening. If you don't feel like you have to rake up every single leaf in your yard, even if you leave a few pockets of leaves in the corners, the leaves are going to provide a hiding place for insects, and in turn provide food for a lot of ground feeding birds like sparrows, ovenbirds, some kinds of thrushes. They all feed on the ground. And so if you can provide the cover for the insects, and then the birds will find the insects in there too. Leaving the leaves also allows them to decompose and help to enrich the soil, add organic material to the soil, which then in turn will help the plants to grow better. Leaving the leaves and leaving plants standing in the winter can also help provide food for birds. A lot of those seed heads that remain standing even after a few snowfalls are a great source of food for insect-eating birds. So we want to leave some of that stuff alone out there. One thing you also want to look at is making layers within your yard, within your landscape. And if you think about a natural system, you've got very tall trees, you've got the canopy of the trees, you've got shorter understory trees, you have layers of shrubs, you have the low plants that grow on the forest floor. And birds will use those layers in different ways. Sometimes birds will feed on the ground but nest in the canopy. Or maybe they nest in the shrub layer and they feed in the trees. So by providing a lot of different layers using vines and shrubs and ground covers and trees and shrubs, you are creating more places for birds to find the food and the shelter that they need. In this example, the vine that you see in the foreground, it looks like Virginia creeper, which is a native plant. There's some Virginia creeper climbing up on the sides of the house there. They've got some evergreens. They've got, looks like maybe a dogwood there and some taller trees in the back. But lots of layering for birds to find food and shelter. Of course, we want to avoid invasives. And as Janine mentioned earlier, sometimes when you go to the nursery, they may be selling you something that could be invasive. Now, Wisconsin does have a law that prohibits the sale of many plants that are considered invasive. But you have to know what it is you're buying and know the characteristics of the plant. The one on the left, barberry, it's a beautiful plant. Gets really nice red berries on it. Birds like the berries, but it spreads really quickly and it has become a big problem in a lot of woodland areas. Now, there are cultivars out there that they tell us are sterile, that they will not produce fruit and won't become invasive. I would be a little bit skeptical of that. I'm not sure. I haven't read research about how true that is, but again, that's one of the invasives that you want to avoid. In the center there is multiflora rose. If you lived in the Midwest and during the 1930s and 40s, that was widely promoted by the Department of Agriculture as a living fence. Well, it's very thorny and it does work as a living fence, and it also provides good soil erosion control, but it's very, very aggressive. And I don't know how many millions of dollars have been spent to try to eradicate this plant that was so widely promoted. The vine on the right there is porcelain berry. This was just recently listed, I believe, as restricted in Wisconsin. So you probably will not find this anymore at nurseries. And then one on the bottom is bittersweet, and I included that one because there is a native bittersweet, which is just fine. There's also an oriental bittersweet that's out there. And again, you have to be careful about which one you're buying because the oriental is very, very aggressive. The nice thing is there are alternatives. If there's an invasive plant that you just love the color of it or the look of it, usually you can find a native substitute. For example, the purple loosestrife grows in wet areas, beautiful spikes of pink flowers. Instead of planting loosestrife, you can plant marsh blazing star, a native prairie plant. It grows in wetter prairies, so the moisture doesn't bother it. Nice purple spikes of flowers. Very much the same, but not the invasive qualities. Or instead of barberry, one of the reasons people plant barberry is because it has this great fall color. So do blueberries. Blueberries are gorgeous in the fall, and you get fruit besides. So thinking about, what are the characteristics of that plant that I want to plant? What kind of native plant will suit that same purpose? Definitely, if you want birds in your yard, as we mentioned before, you need to cut down or eliminate using pesticides. A bug-free yard is not a bird-friendly yard. Now, that picture on the right, which shows all those caterpillars eating a plant, if most gardeners saw that, their first reaction would be to run for the bug killer. But that's a buffet for birds. And I'm guessing that if there are any birds in the neighborhood, within a day or two, all of those caterpillars would be gone. If the birds find them, they're going to feast on them. And sometimes, reducing or eliminating pesticide use, we have to become a little bit more tolerant of some slightly not beautiful plants. You have to be able to tolerate a little bit of insect damage, knowing that the birds are going to help control those insects and prevent further damage. It's nice in your yard if you can keep some of the dead trees or limbs if you have a woods near your home. Dead trees, of course, provide food and nesting sites for woodpeckers. Other birds can move into those cavities that the woodpeckers made. So again, that's another, the cover or protection side of habitat that dead trees and limbs can provide. If you can provide a water source, like I said, if you've got a natural stream or a pond, that's incredible. But you can provide water in a lot of very simple ways. A bird bath will be very, very attractive. One of the things, birds seem to like water that's moving. So what you can do is put a little bubbler, a little fountain in the bath, or even I've seen people who take milk jugs, punch a little hole in the bottom so that the water drips out gradually. And that little bit of dripping water, you'd be amazed at how happy birds will be when they find a source of water in your yard for bathing and for drinking. So now we get to the really fun part. What are some of the good native plants that we should consider for birds? So I'm going to give you some of my favorite plant recommendations for birds. Deciduous trees, first of all. A lot of deciduous trees have berries on them or seeds or acorns that are valuable to birds. But again, we also want to look at the insect component of it. What kinds of trees are going to support a lot of insects? So oaks are probably one of the best. White oak supports over 400 different kinds of insects. So that's providing a huge amount of food for birds, as well as the acorns, which are eaten by blue jays and wild turkeys and some other birds. Maple trees on the lower left there, maples have seeds that birds enjoy, but again, they're also very, very well used by insects. So the insect populations are going to help to support the bird populations. In the center, we have birches. Birches provide seed in the middle of the winter. That's when their seed heads kind of open up. And so in the winter, when seeds are hard to find, the birds are going to be using the birches. On the upper right there is a native cherry, probably a pin cherry. That's another one that's really good, not just because of the fruit, but because of the insect life it supports. And then willows. Willows are an excellent tree. They are used by, there's actually not a lot of butterflies that their caterpillars feed on different kinds of willow. So that's definitely one to consider in your home landscape. Evergreen trees are really nice to provide the shelter or cover component of habitat, particularly things like spruces, which have nice dense needles. help to protect the birds from predators, also help to protect them from snow in the winter. Pines, the seeds of pines are eaten by a lot of different birds. And of course, the native white cedar. All of those are excellent additions to your landscape. Shrubs, again, woody plants. Many of our shrubs produce berries. Some of them are also very good for insects. The upper left there is a plant called serviceberry. And if I was going to recommend one plant to anybody, it would probably be serviceberry. It's a beautiful 3-season plant. It gets white flowers in the spring. It gets blue fruit on it in the summer, which is delicious if you can beat the birds to it. Cedar waxwings are really fond of this, and you might not think you have cedar waxwings anywhere in your neighborhood until the serviceberry starts ripening, and then they show up from nowhere. It also has really nice fall color, beautiful orangey yellow fall color. There's a lot of varieties of serviceberry out there. Some are tree forms, get to be 20, 25 feet tall. Some of them are more kind of a multi-stemmed shrub and might be in the 6 to 8 foot range. So there's many, many different varieties of those out there. The center top there is elderberry, another one that grows in really poor conditions. It'll come back. Sometimes it winter kills, but you can cut it down to the ground and it'll come back again. Lots of fruit for birds. The upper right there is a viburnum. There's a lot of different kinds of viburnums that are native, but most of them have blueberries and pretty good fall color as well. The rose is a native rose, maybe a meadow rose, pollen and nectar for insects, but also the rose hips are eaten by a lot of different kinds of birds. The middle bottom picture there is winterberry. It's our native holly, and those berries stay on, they hold on well into the winter months. So again, that's a source of food for birds during a time when food is hard to find. And then the lower left-hand picture there is a dogwood. There's a lot of native dogwoods. Again, provide lots of berries for birds, but also insects use the dogwoods. So you get food in that way also. When you consider vines, there's a few native vines that you might use. Wild grapes tend to be a little aggressive. I don't recommend them a lot, but if you have the space for them to grow on a fence or something like that, they're really nice. The lower picture there is Virginia creeper, or sometimes it's called woodbine. Those berries are not edible for humans, but they are very attractive to birds. Woodbine, by the way, also makes a great ground cover. If it has something to climb up, it will. Otherwise, it'll just spread along the ground and it'll choke out a lot of other weeds. The bittersweet on the right, again, make sure that you're getting the native bittersweet and not the non-native. And then poison ivy. I love to throw that in because a lot of people don't realize poison ivy is pretty beneficial to wildlife. Birds like woodpeckers will eat the berries, and some insects actually feed on the leaves. So if you have poison ivy in your yard and you can tolerate it, it's in a corner that you don't go into very often, or you just remember to avoid it, it's actually a good plant to keep in your birdscape. Nectar plants. Here we go with the hummingbirds. Who doesn't like hummingbirds? They're amazing. So you can think about planting things that are going to attract them in particular. Red flowers like the cardinal flower on the left. I'll give you a little warning about cardinal flower. It's a beautiful plant, but it usually only lives a couple of years. I don't know why this is. But it self-seeds a lot. So your original plant might die out, but chances are you're going to continue to have those plants coming up from seed. Just an absolute hummingbird magnet. They adore it. The native columbine on the top, those deep spurs, those long spurs are full of nectar that hummingbirds and also butterflies and some species of bees that have very long tongues can reach up there and get that nectar. And then on the bottom there is wild bergamot or monarda. Again, tubular flowers with a lot of nectar. That's the key to getting hummingbirds into your yard. Seed plants. Again, for the birds that like to eat seeds, you can plant native sunflowers. You can plant the coneflowers, the echinacea. Again, kind of watch out for the cultivars that have lots of extra petals because they're not going to produce any seed at all. And goldenrod. I like to put goldenrod in because it's a plant that kind of has a bad reputation. People blame it for their hay fever in the fall. It's really not the goldenrod that's the cause of that. But goldenrod provides a lot of nectar and pollen and then seeds for birds. And the goldenrod usually are pretty stiff stemmed, so they'll stand up into the winter even after a couple of snowfalls. So a great fall and winter food source as well for birds. Consider putting some grasses of different types in your landscape. They can be used, like I said, the Nomo fescue or other low-growing grasses can be used as a lawn substitute. Grasses provide seeds that birds like. They're also a neat, if you're looking at landscape design, grasses can be the backdrop or the help to emphasize the flowering plants that we use. A couple of the natives that I particularly like, the lower left is little blue stem. It gets about 3 to 4 feet tall. It's a clumping grass, stays in a nice upright clump. Pretty fall color, gets kind of red and sometimes purplish colors in the leaves and these little silvery seed heads. Very attractive plant. The one in the middle is prairie dropseed, probably my favorite native plant. Forms a arching mound of grass about 2.5 feet tall or so. And then it gets these very open, airy seed heads on it, which are really, really beautiful. And then the one on the right is Indian grass. This is if you want a nice tall accent. Indian grass will get to be 6 or 7 feet tall. It's also kind of a clumping grass, but it has these pretty feathery seed heads on it. So consider throwing some native grasses into your landscape. If you're interested in learning more, there's a couple of good resources out there that I want to just recommend. The Wild Ones organization, as I mentioned earlier, they have a lot of good resources on their website, which is wildones.org. One of the articles that I think they have posted on their website now is written by Mariette Novak, Wisconsin's best native plants for attracting birds. So that's a wonderful resource. And she also has a book out called Birdscaping in the Midwest, which is really wonderful. It talks about the growing conditions for different natives and what birds they attract. So I recommend both of those. The National Wildlife Federation also has on their website a native plant guide where you can put in your zip code and they will actually send you an email with a list of recommended plants, native plants for your area, which I think is really wonderful and it takes a lot of the research work out of it. Dr. Douglas Tallamy, I mentioned him earlier. He has a couple of books which I highly recommend when you're looking at native landscaping. Bringing Nature Home is a little older book that he wrote, and then more recently, The Living Landscape, Designing for Beauty and Biodiversity in the Home Garden. Both of those are incredible resources. So I guess with that, the only thing that's left is to ask, what natives can you add to your yard? What can you put in, whether it be just a little garden patch at the edge of your patio? Maybe it's a larger installation. Maybe you plant an oak tree. What can you do? Think about what you can do in your yard and what you can do to help benefit birds. So with that, I don't know if anyone has submitted any questions. I will throw that back. I'm going to finish sharing my screen here. I can figure out how to do that. There we go.
So Lydia, are there any questions out there on Facebook?
No, there's none on Facebook.
None at all. Oh.
That's okay. We're getting close to our time.
Yes, we are. Yes, so
yeah.
We probably wouldn't have much time.
I have to put a plug in there for No Mow Fescue, which I've had some great luck with. In 3 years, I've only mowed once.
That's great. Yeah.
So it's a great, it's a great ground cover.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't want to mow. Mm-hmm. And I don't want to owe a mower. So yeah. Hey, everyone out there, if you are a master gardener, this will count for education hours for you. So make sure you record your education hours online and you will get your continuing ed credit for this. And yeah, I learned a lot and a couple of things I've done right. I'm like, oh, good. I've done that right.
Yeah, I would just say if anyone does have questions or you're interested in contacting me, you can just give me a call. I'll even give you my phone number, or you can just contact me through Janine, and I would be happy to help you out. Our garden center at Door Landscape will be opening May 1st, so you can come out and see some of these plants in hand and start making your selections there.
Yeah, that's a good, going and actually seeing them, and going to someone's garden that has really done a good job. Like Karen's garden is wonderful. She's got some cool water elements. One's a musical instrument. I think it was a trumpet.
Trombone, yeah.
Trombone. And she's got a great yard. But I like to just look at other people's yards that are like really and really nice, and saying, what did you do to do that? And they usually say, well, why don't you take some?
Yeah.
People are always giving from their gardens. And so, yeah, just look around, and there's a lot of beautiful gardens in Door County. But yes, Karen, you did a great job. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I'm happy to do it.
Yeah. And I'm going to get a service berry. I said, if I, what do I want to buy this year? I'm going to try that service berry.
It's a
That would be
fantastic
good.
plant. Love
Yeah.
it.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, thank you so much. And we'll see you around. Goodbye, everyone. Thanks for
Bye.
joining.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.